Hello everyone, welcome to the Wuxia Audiobook. Today, we will continue to the next part of the series Renegade Immortal.
Chapter 6, Insults. Taizhu was silent as Wang Qiwo, in a derisive tone, said, "I have said before that this kid didn't have any talent. All he did was go and lose face for our family. I passed on the first test, so I didn't see him until later on. A few days later, I heard that he failed all 3 tests. He might as well not have gone. I would have preferred it if fourth uncle's son had gone instead." Taizhu's fourth uncle frowned and said, "Wang Qiwo, even if you're going to become an immortal, what can you possibly know about what my son can or can't do? The audacity!" There was a flash of coldness in Wang Qiwo's eyes. He quietly laughed, but didn't say anything. Taizhu's father suddenly looked like he had aged more than 10 years and fell down to his seat. Taizhu's mother was also shocked. She couldn't believe what was happening. She asked, "Taizhu, is this true?" Taizhu bit his lip until it started bleeding. He fell to the ground and kowtowed a few times. He whispered, "Mom, Dad, Taizhu wasn't selected by the immortals. I'm sorry, I will repay you both in the next life." Taizhu's mother realized her son was in despair. She quickly ran and helped Taizhu to his feet. She whispered, "Child, don't worry. So what if you weren't selected by the immortals? Next year there is the district exam. Child, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't do anything stupid either. Your father and mother still expect you to be at our funerals." Taizhu's father snapped out of his daze. He realized the kind of mental state Taizhu was in. His heart trembled, and he quickly ran up to his son. Holding him, he nervously said, "Taizhu, you better not do anything stupid. Listen to your dad. Let's go home and study hard for next year's district exam." The surrounding relatives quickly moved away from Taizhu's family. They all gathered around as if they were watching a show, gossiping and sharing comments about the event unfolding before them. Taizhu's 6th uncle quipped, "I always knew that this Taizhu kid didn't have any talent. How could he compare to Wang Qiwo? Totally right. Since this was bound to happen, why act like he was already accepted? How shameful. Lao, you are this old already. How could you still do something so stupid? No wonder Dad didn't give you a share of the inheritance back then," said Taizhu's 3rd uncle sarcastically. "If you ask me, the story that this kid has always been smart since he was a child was fabricated. It was probably because Lao knew that he himself was a failure. He tried to raise his son's reputation by lying, and now he's been exposed," said Taizhu's 5th uncle, whose face had turned ugly. A female relative scoffed, "Out of the 3 children that went to test, only he failed. Taizhu is the worst child in our Wang family. Second sister-in-law, I earlier said you had good fortune with second brother. Now it seems like your luck will keep dwindling for the rest of your life." Taizhu's 5th aunt also sneered, "Isn't that right? When I went to see Taizhu a few days ago, I was wondering how he could compare to Wang Hao and Wang Qiwo at all." Another female relative mercilessly said, "I had already seen that kid Taizhu didn't have any talent. Just look at his mum and dad. How could they give birth to anyone good? In our Wang family, only eldest brother and third brother's kids are any good. Taizhu, just with that name he sounds like an idiot. I was totally blind back then, about to push my daughter into a pit of fire. Good thing we found out beforehand that Taizhu wasn't selected by the immortals. My daughter would have hated me forever if I had her marry him. Taizhu's mum, let us forget about this whole thing. Since your Taizhu won't become an immortal, who would want their daughter to marry him? Isn't that like a toad wanting a swan's meat?" In a few moments all the relatives turned into snobs. They continuously launched a barrage of insults at Taizhu's family. Compared to the previous scene, it was like heaven and earth. There were even relatives who went as far as to ask for the gifts they gave back. Seeing his parents' pale faces, Taizhu tightened his fist. Listening to all the insults left him wishing he was dead. Wang Qiwo's father laughed inwardly, and sneered, "Lao, didn't I tell you that to become an immortal's disciple, you need fate on your side? How could there possibly be any chance unless you have talent like my son? Yet you seriously believed it would be possible. Now you made your son wish he was dead. Was there a need for this?" Taizhu's father couldn't hold in his anger any longer. He shouted, Wang Jianshan, shut your mouth. Back in the day, father on his deathbed left me a part of the inheritance. You worked with the other relatives to steal it away from me, and now you are here insulting me. Do you really think I, Wang Jianshui, will quietly endure this? And all you people as well. Earlier you were happily congratulating me, and now you are here insulting us. Our son is already in this state, yet you add insult to injury. Are you all still human? Wang Jianshan paused for a moment and said, why bring up the past? I warned you with good intentions that your son didn't have any talent, but here you are being angry at me. Humph, with a dad like you, the son won't be much better. All the insults thrown at the crestfallen Wang Lin were like thorns piercing his heart. He coldly looked at everyone and engraved their faces into his heart. I'll fight you to the death. Tai Zu's father couldn't hold in his anger any longer and picked up a chair. Tai Zu's fourth uncle rushed up and stopped him, whispering, brother, don't be impulsive. Elder brother has many servants. Listen to me, don't bother with him. Tai Zu's fourth uncle glared at Wang Jianshan and said, eldest brother, is that any way to talk? I will not listen to this any longer. If you dare to keep insulting my second brother, don't blame me for not caring about family ties. While the Wang family is big, I have made many friends during my travel. Don't push me to burn it all. Wang Jianshan murmured a few words. He still feared the well-connected fourth brother. Lao Si, what you are saying is unreasonable. We aren't wrong in pointing out that Lao Ya's son doesn't have any talent. What's wrong with us, the older generation, scolding the younger? What you're saying is too unreasonable, said the family's third eldest uncle with discontent. Chapter 7, Leaving Home. That's right. Fourth brother, we are speaking for you because you gave your spot to second brother. What Wang Qiwo said was correct, your son is stronger than Taizhu. He might have really gotten selected by the immortals. Taizu's fifth brother added on the side. Wang Qiwo, with a proud smile, gloated, their family brought all this upon themselves. My father and I warned them beforehand. This useless family is about as stubborn as a donkey. Now they hit a wall. Wang Hao, with a pale face said, Taizhu, he. Before he could finish, Wang Hao's father shot him a fierce look. He lost all confidence and kept quiet afterwards. Taizu's fourth uncle let out a deep sigh and said, whoever brings this up again means he has something against me. Let this be done. Taizhu not being selected can only be said that he wasn't fortunate enough and nothing else. Taizhu, don't take it to heart, you can come to your fourth uncle for anything. I have no say in immortal sects, but when it comes to normal sects, your uncle still has some ability to get in you. You can go with my son, Huzi. I've always planned to send him to a sect to train. Wang Qiwo chuckled when he heard that. He scornfully said, Taizhu, I say go with fourth uncle. When you get there, you can tell them you were the trash that was rejected by the immortals. They might really take you. Wang Lin slowly raised his head. He looked around, glaring at all the surrounding relatives. When his eyes finally landed on Wang Qiwo, he said, Wang Qiwo, mark my words. I, Wang Lin, will definitely enter an immortal school. I'll also never forget how you and your father insulted my family. Wang Qiwo laughed when he heard Taizu's words, but before he could say anything else, fourth uncle shouted at Wang Qiwo, you wordy little brat. I'm going to waste you right now. Let's see if the immortals still want you then. Wang Qiwo's father suddenly looked pale. He hurriedly stepped in front of Wang Qiwo. Fourth brother, you wouldn't dare? The surrounding relatives all held a cold smile on their faces as they watched the events unfold in front of them. Taizu's fourth uncle laughed. He had a steely look in his eyes. In a low, deep voice, he said, really brother? I wouldn't dare. Taizu's father quickly stepped forward to pull his fourth brother back. Fourth brother, listen to your second brother. You have a wife and kids at home, acting like this isn't worth it for you. I will forever remember what you have done for me, just bring my family home. Fourth uncle glared at Wang Qiwo's father. He then nodded at his second brother, and proceeded to leave the house with Taizhu and his family. Even from afar, Wang Lin could hear the relatives in the yard mocking him and his family. The family sat in fourth uncle's carriage as he gave them a ride home. Silence enveloped the inside of the carriage. Taizu's father quietly sighed. It'd be false to say that he wasn't disappointed, but Taiju was still his son. He finally broke the silence. Taiju, this is nothing, all right? When I was forced out of the house before, I was much more despondent than you, yet I still persevered. Listen to your father. Go home and study. Strive towards a good result in next year's district exam. If you don't feel like reading, go relax with your fourth uncle. Taiju's mother gave her son a loving look and consoled him. Taiju, don't do anything stupid. You're my only son. If anything happens to you, I wouldn't want to live anymore. You have to be strong. As she was talking, tears rolled down her face. Wang Lin looked at his parents. He nodded and said, Father, Mother, rest assured. I will not do anything silly. Don't worry, I have a plan. Taiju's mother embraced him. While holding him in her arms she said, Taiju, it's over. We will forget about this matter. In his mother's warm embrace, Taiju's wounded heart was slowly healing. He felt exhausted after the events of the last few days. As the carriage bounced up and down, Taiju slowly drifted into sleep. He saw a dream. He dreamt that he was an immortal, flying in the sky with his parents. When Taiju woke up, it was late at night. He sighed lightly as he looked around at the familiar room. His heart was resolute. Before he left the house, he took a long, deep look at his sleeping parents. He picked up a pen and paper, and wrote a letter. After taking enough dry food, he was on his way. I will not give up on the path to becoming an immortal. I must try to join a Hang Yue sect one more time. If they still won't accept me, I must at least find the location of other immortal sects. Wang Lin's eyes were filled with resolve as he left the mountain village, carrying only a bag. With the moonlight paving the road and stars marking his direction, Wang Lin made his way forward, only his long shadow for company. 3 days have passed. Wang Lin was walking on a remote mountain road. He had opened his eyes back when the young immortal was holding him. He could still recall the general direction. Heading east, Wang Lin ignored the weeds that were cutting both his legs. He kept moving forward. After a week, he had already entered the inner parts of the mountains. Fortunately, there were no man-eating beasts here. Wang Lin pursued his path carefully. Today, when he looked up, he was finally able to see the familiar misty peaks on an isolated hilltop. Taiju was completely exhausted at this point. He took out some dried food and took a few bites while staring at the Hang Yue sect's entrance. The hairs on the back of Wang Lin's neck stood up as he heard a wild animal breathing behind him. He looked back and all the color instantly drained from his face. A large white tiger with blood-red eyes made the air feel dense. Drops of saliva dripped out of the corner of its mouth, producing dripping sounds as they hit the ground. The white tiger roared as it pounced. Wang Lin revealed a bitter smile, and without hesitation jumped off the side of a cliff. He felt the wind on his face as he plummeted down. He couldn't help but remember the looks in his parents' eyes, as well as all the relatives that taunted him. Father, Mother, your son didn't listen to you. This is goodbye. The wall of the cliff was covered in a myriad of branches. Taiju's body was getting cut by the branches as he dropped at breakneck speed. A few moments later, in the middle of the drop, Taiju felt an enormous force pulling him. Wang Lin had no control of his body as the force pulled him. Before he knew it, he was inside a cave that had been carved onto the wall of the cliff. He felt great force constantly pulling his body against the wall. After a long time the force finally disappeared and he fell down from the wall. It took him a long time to regain his senses. As Taiju struggled to get back up, he noticed his clothes were torn and his body had gotten scraped all over by the branches. Pain came flooding in from his swollen right arm. Large drops of sweat streamed down, sticking to every part of his body. Wang Lin touched his arm, but he couldn't tell if the bones were broken. This injury was definitely sustained when he hit the wall. Chapter 8, Stone Bead. Taiju was pale as he got up and looked around. He found that he was in a small natural cave. The sunlight peered in through the entrance of the cave, revealing a floor covered with the bones of birds and animals. On the wall behind him was a black hole the size of a fist. He couldn't tell how deep this little hole was, but on closer inspection one mystery was solved. The pulling force that sucked him into the cave earlier came from this hole. The animals that those scattered bones had belonged to were sucked in just like he had been. The suction from the hole must be spontaneous. The moment he appeared in front of this cave during his fall, the mysterious hole pulled him in and saved his life. Taiju, enduring the agony of his right arm, was about to walk out of the cave when the bones on the ground suddenly started moving toward the hole. He quickly rolled to the corner of the cave without a moment's delay as he felt the wind behind him. The unimaginable sucking force suddenly came from the little hole. All the bones rattled as they flew toward the hole. Some of the bigger bones were stuck on the wall blocking the little hole. At that moment, a bird was sucked in as it flew by the cave's entrance. It whizzed through the air until it splattered against the cave wall. After about an hour, the force stopped pulling. Wang Lin stared in horror at the corpse of the recently deceased bird. He didn't move his body at all, only sat still, while calculating the time. Half an hour later, the suction started again. This repeated several times. Wang Lin had grasped the timing of the strange suctioning hole. It would start sucking every 30 minutes for a duration of 60 minutes. Taking advantage of the time gap between suctions, Wang Lin painfully crept towards the cave entrance. As he looked below, he couldn't help but reveal a bitter smile. Below him was a jungle, and the barely visible ground was covered with rocks. The cliff was very steep, there was no way for him to climb down with his broken arm. The distance from the ground measured more than a few dozen meters. If he tried to jump down, it would definitely be the end. The bag filled with food was left at the top of the mountain with no way for him to retrieve it. Right now food was the most important problem he needed to solve. As he was pondering, he suddenly remembered the suction time and rushed back to the corner of the cave. Time in the outside world seemed to pass by quickly. Wang Lin could feel his body grow weaker and weaker. He had no feeling in his arm, it was completely numb. He smiled bitter as he said to himself, being stuck here means a slow death, but jumping down would be instant death. He looked at the bloody corpse of the bird that was sucked in earlier. With a bit of hesitation, he walked over, picked it up, and reluctantly took a bite. The taste was appalling. He exhaled as the raw meat in his mouth flooded his senses, but then continued to eat it. He barely chewed the meat, opting to just swallow it nearly whole. Taiju felt warmth enter his stomach as it churned. He ate the bird quickly in big bites, then he stood up and took a deep breath to keep himself from puking it all out. He tossed the remains of the bird to the side and sat down against the cave wall. His mind wandered, one moment thinking about his parents, one moment thinking of his fourth uncle, one moment thinking about the mocking faces of his relatives, and one moment he even thought about the cold eyes of a middle-aged man in black from the Heng Yue sect. In a trance, Wang Lin looked at the half-eaten bird corpse. Without batting an eye, he picked up the corpse for a closer inspection. He saw that within the bird's corpse there was a red bead the size of a baby's first. He was very surprised as he took it out of the carcass. Why was there a bead in this bird's body? Wang Lin's heart was pounding as he thought of a book the teacher in his village had once shown him. Some animals live to be much older, and that something called a dantian will form within their body. If one were to eat a dantian, their life would be prolonged, and their strength would increase. Even limbs that had been cut off would grow back. When he saw that description, he didn't believe it, and secretly scoffed at it, but now he couldn't help but to believe in myths and legends a little more after meeting immortals. Wang Lin's heart was pounding hard enough to fly out of his chest. If this bead was really the dantian described in the book, then eating it would not only heal his injuries quickly, but it would also make it easy to leave this place. Even passing the test to join the Heng Yue sect should be possible, at least he would be able to pass the perseverance test. But the bead was very hard. It didn't seem edible. He used some of the ragged cloth on his body to wipe it clean, restoring its original color. A gray bead, with 5 clouds carved on it, was revealed. It looked very old. Wang Lin was very disappointed, unwilling to give up. He gave the bead a bite, then silently laughed at himself. Taiju, you are too delusional. How could some random bird that just happened to fly by have a dantian? Wang Lin sighed. It was already dark outside. He felt weary and fell asleep with the bead by his side and animal bones covering the floor. Since it is fall right now, the temperature dropped very quickly, especially in the mountain area. The cold air entered Wang Lin's body. He curled up, and the night passed by quickly. The next morning, sunlight peered in from the outside of the cave as the sun rose. A few drops of sparkling dew secreted from the bead by Wang Lin's side. As the dew gathered, it dripped onto the bones nearby. After a while, Wang Lin woke up. Not only was his arm still swollen, its condition seemed to have gotten worse. Wang Lin sat on the floor, feeling very depressed. Wang Lin muttered to himself, "Am I going to be stuck here my whole life?" He slowly turned his head and noticed the dew that accumulated on the bones. Since he was thirsty, he carefully picked up a few bones and licked the dew off them. The sweetness of the dew was quite good. He couldn't tell if he was imagining it, but his whole body felt warm and comfortable after drinking some. Especially the injury on his arm. There was feeling of comfort and itching as the swelling lessened. Wang Lin rubbed his eyes, and closely looked at his arm. The swelling had indeed gone down. He quickly looked at the bones around him but wasn't able to find any more with dew on them. At that moment, he suddenly noticed the bead and saw drops of dew on it. He remembered that all the bones that had dew on them were next to the bead. He gently picked up the bead, with his heart pounding, and rolled the bead on his arm to evenly spreading out the dew. Waves of cool and refreshing feelings came from the arm. Wang Lin stared at his arm without batting an eye. After a while his eyes lit up. The swelling from the arm had gone down. He tried waving his arm. While there was still some pain, it wasn't a big deal. This stone bead must be a treasure. Wang Lin was pleasantly surprised. Chapter 9, Down the Cliff. For the next few days, Wang Lin relied on the birds that were sucked into the cave and splattered on the wall for food. He spent most of his time carefully observing the stone bead. Every time dew appeared, he would smear it on his arm. He did this until his arm was fully recovered. He knew this dew was extremely valuable, so he collected some in the skull of a bird. On this day, he sprinkled the dew he had been collecting throughout the past few days on a piece of cloth and carefully warped the bead in it. After making sure it wouldn't fall off, he arrived at the entrance to the cave when the suction force stopped. He used his teeth to tear apart his clothes and tied them together, then tied one end to a rock and the other around his waist and slowly climbed down. Wang Lin had climbed down about 5 or 6 meters when his hand slipped. His body dropped quickly, but luckily his clothes were tough and gave him time to swing toward the cliff and grab onto a branch before the cloth tore. Cold sweat glistened on Wang Lin's forehead. When he looked down, he estimated that he was still 20 meters up. With one hand, he grabbed a branch and with the other hand he grabbed the cloth and tied the cloth onto the branch. Only then did he feel relieved. He carefully moved back toward the cliff edge and then started to descend again. When he was 10 meters from the ground, the cloth had stretched to its limit. Wang Lin jumped down without a second thought. His clothes couldn't bear the weight and began to split apart, but still help lighten the fall. Wang Lin felt the wind caress his face on the way down, as well as branches breaking under him, slowing down his fall. He positioned his body just right as he landed, toes pointing downward, and rolled into a ball as he touched the ground. The ground felt like a stone knife that pierced his body, creating various deep cuts, especially a cut on this leg. It was so deep that you could see the bones. Wang Lin, with blurry vision, gasped for breath. He struggled to put the cloth that was around his neck that contained the bead into his mouth and sucked some dew that was in the cloth. After a while, he struggled to sit up and, with trembling hands, took the cloth and squeezed it above the wound on his leg as a few drops of dew came out. A cool feeling emitted from the place the wound was. After having done all this, Wang Lin fell to the ground and prayed for no beasts to attack him before he recovered. At that moment, he heard a shout from the distance. "Taizhu, where are you?" Wang Lin was stunned. He listened closely and realized that it was his dad's voice. Without time to think, he used all the strength left in his body to shout, "Dad! I'm here!" A rainbow approached from the distance. It circled around the cliff near Wang Lin for a while then descended. A sword of light came down and dissipated, revealing a Heng Yue sect disciple with Wang Lin's father in his arm, frowning at Wang Lin. When Taizu's father saw his son, he immediately burst into tears. He ran up to Wang Lin and hugged him. While crying he said, "Taizu, what were you thinking? Why did you have to be so stubborn? Have you ever thought about how your parents would live if you died?" Wang Lin was stunned. After thinking about it, he realized his dad misunderstood. and thought that he was trying to commit suicide. After looking at himself and seeing how battered his body was, he couldn't help but let out a bit to laugh. The Heng Yue sect disciple, surnamed Jiang, gazed over Wang Lin. He looked to the cliff above and saw the clothes that had been torn earlier. With a few leaps, he climbed up until he reached the cave. He felt a force try to suck him in and showed a surprised expression. However, he quickly recovered and jumped down like the force was no big deal. He said, lowly, your kid wanted to suicide but was saved by this natural suction force from the cave. Now that Wang Lin has been found, let's go back to the sect and have the elder make a decision. The Heng Yue sect disciple rolled his sleeves, grabbed the father-son duo, and quickly left that place. After a while, they arrived at the foot of the mountain of the Heng Yue sect, then climbed the steps and approached the peak. Coming back here like this caused Wang Lin to have mixed feelings. At the peak, there were many people with ugly expressions. The disciple Jiang quickly went up to one of them and whispered something. The old man's brow wrinkled and said with a cold voice, "Since the person was found, send him to the guest room to reunite him with his mother." In the room, when Wang Lin's mother saw her son, she immediately burst into tears and ran up to hug him. After hearing from his parents, he finally knew what was going on. When he ran away from home, his parents returned to the Wang family to find his fourth uncle. The three of them feared for his safety, so they went to find Wang Qiwo's father. With the pressure of his fourth uncle, Wang Qiwo's father reluctantly got the family members to help ask the Heng Yue sect to help. This is the first time the Heng Yue sect has encountered something like this, opted to ignore it at first. However, the reason why Wang Lin ran away from home was due to not being accepted into the Heng Yue sect. Although the Heng Yue sect didn't care about the life and death of a mortal, if he were really to die and the news of it spread to the villages nearby, parents won't want their kids to try to enter the sect. Concerned about the future, they sent out a few disciples to search the area. Wang Lin's father was still worried, so he followed them. And that's what caused the scene before him. After a while, someone sent in some medicine. Taizu's mother hastily thanked the person who delivered it, and carefully fed it to her son. This was indeed medicine produced by an immortal sect. The effect was extremely good. After drinking it, Wang Lin felt that he had recovered quite a lot, and his wound began to ache a lot less. Wang Lin's parents were unceasingly bestowing words of comfort upon him. He wanted to explain everything to them, but he was unsure if they would believe him. At that moment, in a Heng Yue sect hall, several elders were sitting around listening to the disciple Jiang describe how he found Wang Lin. At the end of the long table, a red-faced man said disgruntledly, "What does the life and death of a mortal have to do with an immortal like me? Look at the other immortal schools, which of them are like us who send people to find a kid who tried to suicide because he wasn't selected? This is shameful." Next to him, a middle-aged man with a cold face said, "What Elder Ma said is correct. In all the sects within the state of Zhao, only our Heng Yue sect is like this. But if that kid really died in our mountain range, parents will fear their children would all try to suicide if they were rejected. Then, who would dare to send us their children?" An old man in robe took a sip of tea and said slowly, "In reality, isn't it because our Heng Yue sect has declined that we must select disciples that are suitable for cultivation from mortals? If it was 500 years ago, who would care what the mortals think?" Finally, an old man full of wrinkles sighed and said, "If this youth tried to suicide once, he could try to suicide again. To prevent this issue from continuing, let us just make an exception and accept him as a disciple." After he finished speaking, he gave a side glance to the middle-aged man. Chapter 10, Entering the Sect. The red-faced old man frowned with dissatisfaction and said, "Elderly, is our Heng Yue sect really going to sink so low? To make an exception for the life and death of a mortal?" Elderly opened his eyes and said with a cold voice, "Elder Ma, the patriarch told me to handle this matter. If it's not handled properly, and this piece of trash attempts suicide a second time and his parents spread that we forced their kid to suicide, isn't that more embarrassing? If you are willing to take responsibility on this matter, then I'll let you handle it." The middle-aged man quickly tried to make peace and said, "There is no need to argue. Why don't we let him become a disciple first, then after 8 or 10 years, When he fails to keep cultivating, we can send him back and there will be no problem. The old man in robe responded, if other youths follow suit, what will we do? The middle-aged man chuckled and said, this is an easy task. After this, we have learned our lesson. When we fail people in the future, we should instill in the idea of not suiciding, and that would solve this problem. As for this Wang Lin, since the matter is already this big, let us just take him as a disciple. One extra disciple doesn't matter. Aside from Elder Li, 2 other elders looked thoughtfully at the middle-aged man, not saying a word. The middle-aged man smiled and thought, oh Wang Lin. I have helped all I can. I have repaid you for the piece of metal your 4th uncle has given me. I'm really curious how a mortal managed to get his type of material. What the middle-aged man didn't know was that Wang Lin's 4th uncle had bought it from a blacksmith. He had seen many things, and as soon as he saw it, he knew it wasn't normal. This time, to let Taizhu join the Heng Yue sect, he brought it out. As for what the metal was used for, he didn't know. A piece of metal changed Wang Lin's fate. When the news reached Wang Lin, he couldn't believe it. He was somehow accepted as a disciple for no apparent reason. 2 days later, he saw his parents off from the Heng Yue sect. After seeing the joy on his parents' faces, he decided to seriously cultivate here. However, his way of thinking was changed after his parents left. He was secretly called to the place where disciples get their work assigned and saw a shifty-looking youth. The youth's face was full of contempt. He looked at him and laughed. So you are Wang Lin, the kid that got to be a disciple by suiciding? Wang Lin silently looked at the youth challenging him. The youth sneered, boy, starting tomorrow morning you come to me for work. Your job is to fetch water, no less than 10 vats a day. If you can't finish the work, then no food for you, and if you continue for 7 days then I'll tell the elders to kick you out of the sect. These are your clothes. Remember, honorary disciples can only wear gray. Once you are a true disciple, you will be assigned other colors. After he finished talking, he tossed the clothes to Wang Lin and closed his eyes. Wang Lin picked up his clothes and asked, where do I live? The youth didn't even open his eyes and casually said, go north until you see a row of houses. Give your badge to the disciple there and they will give you a room. Wang Lin left and headed north to the houses. The youth opened his eyes and said, with disdain, to rely on suicide to join, he really is a waste. While walking in the Heng Yue sect, Wang Lin saw many disciples wearing grey uniforms in a hurry with pale and cold faces. Some had tools in their hands and they were all rushing about. After going straight for a while, he saw a row of houses. There were a lot more disciples in grey here, but they hardly talked to each other. After he gave his badge to the yellow-clothed disciple that was in charge, the youth impatiently pointed to a room. Wang Lin had already gotten used to the cold expressions of all the people here. He got to his room and opened the door. It was a large room with 2 wooden beds, a table, and 2 chairs. They were all very clean and were about as new as the furniture at his house. He picked the bed that looked vacant. He placed his luggage down and laid in his bed. Although he had gotten into the Heng Yue sect, it wasn't what he was expecting. He thought that he was going to learn immortal techniques, but it seemed like his job was to fetch water. Thinking about this, he sighed and touched the stone bead in front of his chest. This was the treasure he had acquired. Wang Lin had read many books and he knew the danger of exposing it, as many people would aim for this treasure. A short while later, night fell and an extremely tired youth in grey opened the door and entered. He was stunned when he saw Wang Lin, then proceeded to pass out on his bed without saying a word. Wang Lin didn't care. He knew that he had to wake up early. He touched his stomach, then took out some sweet potatoes. His parents brought them for him to eat when they went out searching for him, and since he was accepted, his parents gave all the remaining food to him. The sweet potato was very sweet. As Wang Lin was eating, the youth woke up and eyed the sweet potato. While his mouth watered, he said in a low voice, "Can I have a piece?" Wang Lin took out a few pieces and said, "I have a lot here. If you'd like, have some more." The youth quickly picked up the food and scarfed it down, then went over to the table and poured himself a glass of water. He exclaimed, "Damn it! I haven't eaten anything in 2 days. So what's your name?" Wang Lin said his name. The youth suddenly laughed and said, So you are Wang Lin, the trash that entered the Heng Yue sect by attempting suicide. He suddenly realized what he had done and said, "Brother, my name is Jiang Hu. To tell you the truth, there is no one in the sect that doesn't know about you, so please don't blame me for what I said before. In fact, I admire you for being able to enter the sect this way." Wang Lin laughed bitterly. He didn't try to explain and passed over a few pieces of sweet potato. Jiang Hu quickly accepted it and took a few bites, then said, "Wang Lin, you better leave some of it for yourself. You are new here. Who knows what evil things that yellow weasel will try to do. Damn it, he doesn't even treat us like humans."